get started here, and I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Korsmo. A little bit about Elizabeth. She is currently the curator for the Tacoma Historical Society, as well as a longtime historian, researcher, living historian, historical interpreter. She's got many, many things on her card. So let's go ahead and hand it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jessica. Really miss Fort Steilacoom. Haven't had a chance to interpret there since Christmas a year ago, so very excited to be able to do something for them and see all you lovely folk. See if I can figure out screen share. 21st century is not my area of interest, so it can get interesting when technology comes involved. And Jessica, is the screen showing up all right?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Let's get started then. So the talk today is about women's work in Washington Territory. Specifically, this grew out of my thesis work at UW on women's clothing and searching through primary sources to try and figure out what people were specifically wearing in Washington Territory in the 1850s and 1860s. I'd start jotting down anything else interesting that came to mind, and the next thing you know, this presentation exists. So a sort of caveat to that is that because of the focus of that original project, specifically on clothing worn by white American women in Washington Territory from 1851 to 1866, this presentation is going to mostly be focusing on the white American settlers. They're also the people I've been able to find the most sources on. So I have a few references to the work done by Native women, but another caveat there that that's mostly being filtered through what white settlers are observing and writing down. So that's just a limitation on this present work. There were a lot of other people, a lot of other women in Washington Territory that I just do not have the ability to speak about in a useful manner. So with that in mind, let's get started. So looking here, 1850s and 60s, the general idea of women's work in America, English-speaking world, is really come down to sort of the 4 C's. You have cooking, you have cleaning, you have childcare, and you have clothing, or just say sort of all textile, building, and maintenance. And that's really what we're seeing out here as well. The real emphasis, though, in a lot of the sources from people like the Denny family here, is on things that are unusual to that experience. And so a lot of the day-to-day stuff just sort of slips through the cracks. No one bothers mentioning it. And that's made it sort of interesting to try and track down. So I'm going to start. Of course, I should have done these slides in other order. Okay, so domestic economy here is just sort of being brought up for an example of the subjects that are being covered in this area. So we have the washing, the dressmaking, the sewing, the cooking, the cleaning, and of course, how to tell servants to do that for you if you're in a position to have them. So I'm going to start with childcare because it's probably the subject that I found the least information on, period. It's just something that has to happen every single day, and as a result, people aren't really talking about it very much, except for when something unusual happens. So when the young Denny sisters on the Oregon Trail in 1851 lose a pair of shoes and have to then share theirs, that ends up in the memoirs. But out of all the family's memoirs, that's almost the only time that the children are mentioned in the entire trail is Lenora losing her shoes and having to share with Louisa for the Louisa. It should specify that's Louisa Catherine, her sister, not Aunt Louisa, who's going to be showing up again later. They aren't showing up very much. It doesn't help that most of our sources are actually also from men, who, as far as I can tell, are not the ones doing the childcare. So a lot of I have to go on is indirect. Things like Ezra Meeker leaving his wife and young infant in Oregon while he's off exploring in the Puget Sound area to find a homestead. So by implication, Eliza Jane Meeker is the one providing sole care for their child for the 6 weeks that he's gone. This happens again when he's going out over the Natchez Trail to look for a wagon train that's gone astray. The child stays with her, so she has to be the one taking care of it. One of the few exceptions where people are explicitly talking about their children is actually from the letters of Catherine Blaine. And I think part of that reason is that she's not writing a memoir after the fact, as a lot of our sources are, people reminiscing about the good old days and the hard work they had at a given time. But she's actually writing letters to her mother-in-law, and she's writing them not just about her daily life, but also about the baby that she's had since she came to Oregon and that they've never met. Um, Baby John is born in Seattle in January of 1858, and the family shortly thereafter moves to Portland because of all the excitement happening in Seattle in 1858. But in the letters, she writes a fair amount about the child just because grandmothers haven't had a chance to see him. So she includes such charming anecdotes as an instance where the baby starts chewing on her pencil as she's writing, and that he's made several marks on the page as a result. Or another account from June, she says that baby is 5.5 months old, with 20 pounds, has 2 teeth, can sit, and says Papa. I've put short clothes on him, and it makes him look so cunning. Short clothes are going to be infant dresses that are shorter than foot length. So if you think of like an old-fashioned christening dress where the skirt of the dress is really, really long compared to the body, and it's going to be covering baby's feet, that's pretty standard infant apparel for infants that are not yet moving on their own. So definitely after about 6 months or so, long dresses help keep babies' feet warm because they aren't crawling or walking anywhere. That's when they go into the short dresses, which are generally just right about knee length and give them a lot more easy ability to move. She also has a few other references to sewing for the baby that are scattered throughout. He gets a series of 3 calico short dresses in June, and then another set of dresses in a warm plaid in the autumn, as well as some outerwear of the same piece of cloth. There's also, and isn't women, this is her husband, but it's just such a cute little image. He was writing to his parents about the baby to say that I made him a little cart when we were in Portland, worth about $20. The wheels are just large buggy wheels and painted red with black stripes. The box is shaped like a shoe, long enough for him to lie down in and bundle up, and is painted sky blue. I have the material for a top, but have not yet put it on. It will have 3 bows to be covered with enameled black cloth. The top will be fixed to fall back like a buggy top. I have no boy to draw it, so I will have to be the horse myself. Johnny is very fond of riding. So that's the Blaines and their first son. Now get on sort of the next category that is unfortunately not covered very extensively, would be in the realm of cleaning. If you're living in, say, the Meeker's first cabin, which is about 10 feet to a side with a dirt floor and a small stone chimney, only 7 feet tall, you're not going to be doing the same sort of cleaning that shows up in publications from this period, where they're talking about how to keep an entire house clean, assuming you have multiple rooms and a floor. However, when we're getting over to, say, Fort Steilacoom's beautiful officers' houses from 1857, then I expect you're going to be seeing a lot more what you might consider traditional or standard cleaning from the period. Possibly as a result of the living conditions or just that sort of daily grind, lack of interest. Not found any regional specific references to what people are doing for housekeeping. But if we're going with sort of the American norms for the period, someone who's living in an actual house might have a day that looks something like wake up, wash yourself, get dressed for the day, throw back all the bedclothes, all the sheets and blankets so that the bed airs out, go down to the kitchen, get the stove or fireplace cleaned out, all the old ashes removed, the stove shined up if you're dealing with a metal stove, start the fire, then go to your dining area, a breakfast room if you have one, make sure that that has been cleaned and swept and fresh cloths laid out and the table set for breakfast. Make breakfast. If you have a servant, they will Well, before serving breakfast, also then see about cleaning the parlor and sitting room for the family. After breakfast has been cleared away and eaten, the dishes get washed, then it's time to clean the bedrooms. It's going to look like sweeping, dusting, cleaning the fireplaces if you have them, emptying any slops from the wash areas, that'd be your chamber pot and the gray water from washing, refilling with fresh water, and making the beds. To clarify, this sweeping and dusting is a lot more complicated than in a modern house. You're going to be, if you're sweeping properly, as the domestic economy manuals advise, you're going to be covering the different pieces of furniture with cloths to avoid getting dust on them. You're going to be moving the smaller pieces of furniture out of the way to sweep, sprinkling used tea leaves or sand on the floor to help smooth the floorboards, assuming that you don't have, of course, wall-to-wall carpeting, as very few people would have, and the tea leaves to help clump up dust, and then putting everything back. And then you're also going to be turning the mattresses. Straw with horsehair or wool are the sort of common combinations. And with those mattresses, the idea is that you need to be, for the upper straw one at least, turning it and shaking it up at least a few times a week, with the feather bed on top getting shaken up every single day. And these mattresses are on the low end of things about 20 pounds and human size. So you can see where being a maid or not having a maid and having to do this for yourself starts to become a fairly arduous task. After cleaning all the bedrooms, then have the day's work, maybe a particular room to focus on to properly scrub. You might have sewing and mending to do. There'll be dinner to make. Of course, after dinner, you're going to have all the dinner dishes to do as well, and then the family's mending in the evening. So housekeeping, domestic work is full-time work. Uh, and it's also unfortunately something that no one's really talking about in Washington Territory with any useful degree of specificity. So that's why I actually use the picture here of someone ironing, because that is the one bit of cleaning that I can find specific references to. Um, there's actually even going back all the way to overland trails, people on their way to Washington. On average, seeing trail diaries mention washing happening about once every 2 weeks, assuming that there is water available and the weather permits. Even occasionally, they'll speak of the women having their way and insisting that the wagon train lay over for a day so that they can wash when there's available water. Later, when they're settled in Seattle, Mrs. Blaine will be doing her washing every week. She references it not very often in her letter, except that her and her sisters like to share back um, laundry tips. And so she'll mention, for instance, when she's sick and isn't able to do a wash, she has to put it off till next week. But she's feeling better there, so she's going to try and get 2 weeks washing done. She writes that a piece of advice her sister sent her will not be possible to execute out here in the territories because she can't get the right kind of soap. However, she was very successful at using lime juice and salt to clean the and dust off of her husband's Panama hat. And so perhaps her sister wants to try that. And lemon juice will probably work, but she can't get them out here, so she doesn't know for certain. In another instance, Mary Walker, a missionary pioneer who traveled in the late 1830s, ahead of most of the other people I was able to read, describes her and her traveling companions putting on their nightgowns in order to do laundry on the trail because they wanted to be able to wash all of their clothing, including the stuff they would otherwise be wearing, and that they didn't have any tubs to work with, so they had to heat water, wash, boil, and rinse all in the same kettle. She also comments that the creek water they were using was too hard for the soap and they could not get a good lather from it. Another sort of trail instance, when the Denny Party, early Seattle residents, arrived in Oregon and were preparing to take the schooner Exact up to Alki Point, West Seattle. In order to get ready for the event, the women set about washing and starching all of the clothing that they had, and particularly their sunbonnets, because they wanted to be clean and neat. And that not having an ironing board, they actually spread a cloth upon the short grass and ironed on a cloth on the grass, which I think is really sort of telling for what degree of sort of what these people think is normal. Because I know if I was trekking across the continent, ironing would not be anywhere near a priority, and yet they see it as a very normal part of washing clothes and having neat and respectable appearance, and aren't going to let the lack of an ironing board stop them, or the fact that they're doing this outside on the grass. I think I'll leave laundry there since I know that Peggy covered that pretty well 2 weeks ago. I did find it interesting that some of the most common references to daily work are, in fact, to the grind of ironing. Probably the fact that it's something that you're doing weekly or bi-weekly rather than daily makes it a little more of an occurrence. Uh, which then leads to sort of the next big C, cooking, which also has just enough novelty happening that people will occasionally reference it, fortunately. Um, this particular illustration I'm using here from 1867 was one of the few I could find of someone from the period trying to draw camp cooking out on the trail. Though in this instance, in 1867, the woman actually has a camp stove that she's cooking on to better replicate the sort of stove she'd be cooking on in a house. As far as I can tell, none of the overland travelers who arrived in Washington in the 1850s that I've read mention any sort of a device. They, particularly Meeker, strongly implies they're all cooking over open fires with some combination of frying pans, Dutch ovens, and then just the fire itself. Mrs. Meeker in particular is apparently quite clever, able to do things such as making a blackberry cobbler in one instance over a fire. They often refer to things as digging potatoes into the dirt underneath their fire and letting that cook them. There's another memorable occasion, though this time it was a group of men, but it's one of the most explicit descriptions of campfire cooking. It was a group of men working on the Mountain Pass Trail up towards Puget Sound in the 1850s that Meeker encounters. And the way they're cooking over their fire is they each have a frying pan, and they have some pork, and they have some flour. And they're frying the pork in the frying pans, and then using the grease mixed with flour and a little bit of creek water to create a flapjack, which then he calls it baked in the frying pan. Then they take them out of the frying pan, put them on sticks, and toast the flapjacks over the fire, and then use that flapjack, he says, as both platter and table, which to me implies that they're then wrapping the cooked pork in the flapjack batter. They're eating this with coffee. In instances where there's actually women present, the best description I've got of a meal is of a breakfast where Meeker describes the women making breakfast, and they have bread with sugar and tea, which actually doesn't sound that bad. Upon arriving in Washington Territory, though, options are going to be increasing greatly, both for what you're cooking and how you're cooking it, and also who's doing the cooking. Including this advertisement here from 1851. This is from the first issue of the Columbian in Olympia, Washington. And just thought it was very interesting that a town that at this point had about 100 people in it has a designated bakery. And that bakery is offering to furnish bread, cakes, and pies of every description on reasonable terms. And more specifically, that they're also say that balls and parties furnished on the shortest notice, which is a little bit different from the gentleman frying flapjacks in lard over campfire. Balls and parties on the shortest notice. They're expecting that to be something that's coming up. So even in Olympia in 1852, you did not have to be baking all of your own bread. You had the ability to purchase it from other people. Other foodstuffs that are mentioned by name, the Meeker's very first crop that they plant upon arriving in Oregon as they're heading up to Portland. As they're heading up to Puget Sound, they're staying for a summer in Portland, and so they immediately put in a crop of peas, lettuce, onions, and potatoes. And Eliza Jane had a particularly clever moment there where she decided that to make their rations stretch farther, she went and she cut the eyes out of all the potatoes they were eating. These guys making little triangular shaped cuts about the size of a pea. And they dried these potato eyes in their cabin. And then they set up a box of dirt next to the fire and started the new potatoes in a little planter box inside their tiny cabin so that they could make the potatoes stretch longer and still get a decent crop out of them. Other food instances, Mika recounts he purchases clams from a native woman who actually shows him how to do a clam bake in the process, where they cover the hot pebbles and sand where the fire had been with a light layer of pebbles, set the clams on top, spread it over with twigs, and then cover in earth. And that cooks the clams, which were then eaten with boiled potatoes and bread. He traded the bread and potatoes that he had brought to the native people who had the clams. And so it sounds like everyone had a pretty nice meal out of it. Also, I'll have to share this bread recipe if we want to jump back a minute to Crossing the Plains with Phoebe Judson Goodall, future Olympia resident, who went over the plains the year after the Meekers did in '53. And she describes taking the cream from their milking their cow that was with them on the trail and hanging it in a pail from the top of the wagon hoops and letting the jostling of the wagon make the butter for them. And at the same time, to make a light bread while she's on the trail, she took a quart of water, a teaspoon of salt, thickened it with flour to the consistency of a stiff batter with some yeast. She covered it and set it in the sunny front of the wagon, and at noon it would be light and foaming. You add more water and flour, put it in the bread pan, and knead it while jogging along, and then bake it in the Dutch oven at the evening. Coming back to the grand town of Olympia and the sorts of food that's available there. One of the interesting pieces that I was finding is that they start to publish in the newspaper every week the going rate for different supplies, most of which is foodstuff. And it's, of course, where I managed to misplace my notes. Here we are. So list of foodstuffs every week that prices are going for include beef, pork, flour, potatoes, butter, onions, tallow, cheese, eggs, beets, sugar, coffee, tea, molasses, salmon, saleratus, I never can pronounce it right. Yeah, it's a leavening agent. Chickens, pickles, vinegar, salt, candles, linseed oil, sperm oil, and then gets into things like soap, sheeting, drilling, which is utility cloth, hickory shirts, and also tools and lumber. So those are sort of the things that the Columbian at least feels are staples and that some people would be interested in paying attention to the prices. Other newspaper advertisements here as early as 52, 53 will be listing all the wares that have arrived recently from California, including different food items such as barley seed, flour, tea, sugar, coffee, rice, beans, pork, molasses, soap, hats, caps, and getting into the non-food items. Things like clothes pegs, washboards, sugar and flour boxes. So you're getting a fairly wide variety of items that are coming in and that people think you'll be interested in purchasing. By the time we're getting to the end of the 1850s, these sorts of ads have gotten a lot more specific, and they're also a little more wider reaching. For instance, there's an advertisement that shows up later in the Pioneer and Democrat in 53 for a non-alcoholic saloon, candy shop, and confectionery in San Francisco that finds it worthwhile to advertise in Olympia, Washington. The idea that enough people are going back and forth that they will get business this way. So here's some options available. So as we continue on, want to put a quick shout out to women's work outside the home, which is not a ton of. Most of it that I found references to are the same sort of things that women are doing in the home just for pay. So for instance, in 1859, the Blaines have a girl that they hire to help them with some sewing, and then they have another one who stays with them, and she attends school in Portland, and then to pay for her board, she is sort of their part-time servant when she's not in school. The Huggins family out at Fort Nisqually also will have a succession of servants. They try one time to hire a teenager from Steilacoom, but she leaves after a month because she is not suited to service. And otherwise, they tend to hire native women to help with the household chores. You also have, for instance, Eliza Meeker at one point, who becomes a cook in a logging camp because she wants to stay near her husband while he's trying to raise money to help the rest of his family move out west. Um, there's a few other instances, for instance, at the Fort Nisqually records, they talk about hiring groups of Native women to help with particularly the potato harvest. So they'll have women sorting potatoes throughout the winter, and then women planting and harvesting potatoes are the tasks that they get hired for most often. There's also in the Fort Nisqually records women, particularly Native women in the area who are associated with the fort, who take in washing. The Denny papers also make a reference to Princess Angeline, Chief Seattle's daughter, taking in washing later on in her life. Probably the two most interesting cases of women doing something outside of that standard domestic work is the case of Miss Georgia Pearson, one of the youngest of the Mercer girls who arrived in 64, and she is appointed assistant lighthouse keeper at Admiral Head. Turns out her father was appointed lead lighthouse keeper, which makes a little bit more sense, but still found that amusing. And there's another instance recorded by Ezra Meeker of the very first lady sheriff in Pierce County, who was also the daughter of the man who was appointed to that position. Computers. But her father had been arrested for contempt of court, of all things. And as a result, she was seen acting as his deputy, riding her horse with a pistol across her lap and escorting prisoners. And this was Kate Melville, who was apparently a very fine equestrienne in the opinion of Mr. Meeker. So then, now let's get to some clothing, which is my personal favorite and what I can talk about for a million years. Probably should also mention that most of the Mercer girls did become school teachers. Many of them later married, though not all. But at least one of them, I think it was Anna Peebles, that might have been her sister Eliza, was appointed to be the clerk for the Washington Territorial Legislature. So it's a slightly different job. So now for clothing. There was a lot of different cloth coming into Washington Territory in the 1850s. And what I have here as an example is this is the ledger book, the day book of Arthur Denny. It contains the single most boring account of crossing the Oregon Trail ever. He's using his great knowledge as a surveyor to basically spend every day just writing how far they went and nothing else. But after arriving in Seattle, the Arthur started acting sort of as the city's first shopkeeper. He took goods on consignment from different ship captains and then sold them to other people in the area, including all of his in-laws who were part of the party with him. This particular page is a page showing different goods left on account. And I picked this one because this is the one with the single largest list of cloth on it. So all of the letter numbers on the column there are describing different pieces of print. This is probably a cotton print, similar to what we call a calico today, that has been left with him that will be selling at 12.5 or 15 cents a yard. Unfortunately, he does not get into the different colors or patterns, but it is interesting to see that all of these pieces are basically between 30 and 40 yard pieces, but as he's selling them, he's cutting off smaller bouts of yardage for the individual person. In addition to the prints, he also has a large number of muslins at 15 and 16 cents per yard, which is going to be a finer cotton material. And these two items, prints and muslins, are, along with wool delaine, the most common materials for women's clothing that show up in the territory. So speaking of those, the different materials that I can document to Washington Territory for the 1850s and 60s, calico, print, muslin, gingham, which is going to be a cotton that has a small check design, including words, they're hard. You also have ones, chambrays are gingham that has been printed with, that has been woven with different colors in the warp and weft. So you're going to get a sort of multicolored check as opposed to a white plus color. Lawn, which is going to be a really, really fine cotton. It's useful for things like ladies' caps and fine undersleeves. It's very light. Denim, which I don't have documentation for it being used as a women's dress, which is why it's in parentheses, but it was absolutely available. At one point, Louisa Boren Denny buys a piece of blue denim in Oregon and makes a large enough apron from it that she's able to hold an entire deer skin in that apron. She's an interesting person. For wool materials, delaines are by far and away the most common one. Catherine Blaine talks about having a black delaine and a green delaine, which get into some adventures with her. She also makes up a very homely delaine that she is given for an everyday dress. It also shows up in yardages in the stores and in advertisements. But you also have merino, which is going to be a really fine, soft wool made from the merino sheep, which is light and has very little crimp to it. It's also actually something that people who are allergic to wool can often handle because it behaves so much smoother and differently than other wools. Buckskin is a woolen cloth with a heavy nap to it, similar to a velvet. It also wears very hardily. Louisa, with the denim apron, also mentioned she had a blue buckskin dress that she not only wore over the trail, but actually was able to use for a long time afterwards. Alpaca shows up in the documents as well. This is going to be a cotton or silk warp. So that's the part that goes on the loom with the soft alpaca wool thread filling in. So it functions like a wool, but has a really nice sheen to it that made it highly desirable in this period. Linsey woolsey and flannel are also, so linsey woolsey is a linen and wool cross that's very hard wearing. It was used elsewhere for really sort of working and not very prestigious dresses. There's some particular references to it being used for, or sorry, rather by enslaved people because it was very cheap. I haven't, again, found I want to talk about linsey woolsey for dresses, but it was definitely for sale out here. Wool flannel is more often seen for warm undergarments, but it was available. And we also have silks. There's definitely worse silk dresses in Washington Territory. They weren't worn very often. A number of them had things happen to them because they weren't needed. But taffetas, file, which is a silk with woven with sort of a corded texture to it. Pongee, which is a raw silk that's seen as very hard wearing and economical, and crepe, which is used in this period for mourning attire. Again, haven't found reference to it in a dress, but there was mourning crepe in the territory by 1853, since Ezra Meeker accounts going to a wedding and the young man who wanted to marry the bride but wasn't put crepe on his hat because he was sad, and also probably to be funny. So when we're looking at the photographic evidence of the clothing worn in the territory, it's really pretty standard European American dress wear. There's no, people aren't, from the dated photographs we have, people are not dressing many years behind the fashion. They are not wearing particularly regional variations. They're wearing pretty normal clothing. This picture is of Louisa and Mary Boren, later Mrs. David Denny and Mrs. Arthur Denny. And this was taken in the early 50s before they came out. So this is probably actually pretty much what they looked like around the time that they were crossing the trail. Of course, when you get out here, those newspapers have a lot of different dress goods to advertise. By the mid-50s, you have tailors and milliners that are working in Olympia and Steilacoom. You have also lots of fancy dress goods coming in that you could buy. And I actually find it really telling that the advertisers find it worthwhile to buy the column space to list the dry goods and the clothing available, that you will want to come to their establishment and buy things because you know that they have heavy beaver and broadcloth overcoats, frock and sack and dress coats, fancy cashmere and business coats, monkey cashmere, silk and satin vests, satinette, cashmere and doeskin pants, bed linen, gray flannel overshirts. Of course, almost all of that ready-made clothing is for men. Women's ready-made clothing is I won't even say in its infancy at this point. It's basically non-existent. You have hosiery, things like stockings and gloves that are made in a limited number of sizes, shoes that can be made again within a standard range of sizes. But other than that, if you're buying ready-made clothing for women, it's going to be one size fits all accessories like shawls or scarves. Um, Go wait a few decades, you can start ordering things like chemises and undergarments. But for the most part, women's and children's clothing is made for the person who's going to be wearing it out of yardage, or else it is purchased, used from someone that had it custom made, and then altered to fit. So when we're looking for what women's clothing is made of, we're going to be looking mostly at the yard goods. Like here on the Peak and Company advertisement from 53, they talk about fancy prints, calicos, linseys, alpacas, mousselines, delaines. That'd be that fine printed wool. Um, those are the sorts of things that are available in yardage, and those are also very common women's dress materials, and so that's what's going to be available. A few other notes here. I just find it intriguing that, for instance, okay, this is my favorite one of all. If we go to the Lewison ad on the far right side, so that's the first week of November 1858, the first reference to extension hoop skirts in Washington Territory. He's running advertisements every single week in the Pioneer Democrat. The week before, he has this exact same advertisement without the hoop skirts mentioned. So this is the week they arrive, and it's the earliest reference that I've found. And even so, he has that in big block letters to catch your attention. This is something you're supposed to notice. You apparently are supposed to know what extension hoop skirts are, and you're going to want to come in and buy from him, so it's worth his effort and time to have his ad reset with this new information. Another innovation, if we go over to the far left side, Wilson & Wheeler sewing machines, also for sale here in the early 60s. And you're going to see, of course, as almost all of you know, being Fort Nisqually fans, that the Huggins families purchased a sewing machine out of Steilacoom town by 1862, and those are just going to keep proliferating. Within 10 years, you're going to see very few completely hand-sewn garments as compared to sewing machine ones, even out here in the territories. So if we flip back one, the Harper's Magazine here, August number of this excellent magazine. So this is a note that appeared in the Pioneer and Democrat in October of 1857. The August number of Harper's has arrived. This is actually only about 6 weeks after it would have been delivered in East Coast states. From a separate research project, most magazines like Godey's or Peterson's or Harper's are reaching their subscribers in the middle of the preceding month. So if you're living in New York, you're probably getting your copy of Harper's for August in mid-July. It's reaching the Washington Territory out here a little bit after that, but only a matter of weeks. And so you're going to have access to things like sewing patterns, fashion plates, and other information that's going to help keep Washington Territory people dressed very similar to their friends and relatives back east. They aren't, waiting multiple years to find out what the new look is. They're seeing it regularly. And as Emily Inez Denny will write in the 1920s, they were specifically taking patterns out of the magazines and patterning their clothing from what's coming out. She specifically was talking, so she was born in Seattle in 1854, and the talk that she was writing about this for specifically about 1870-71 when she was 16, but a lot of the things she has to say are sort of generalizations over her whole childhood, which would cover Seattle in the late 50s, early 60s. But even so, for instance, Catherine Blaine, with the wagon for her baby who likes to chew on the pencil she writes, she actually will write, when she's writing her letters from Seattle to her family in Seneca Falls, asks for things like a pattern for a sack coat, a pattern for woolen gaiters. She notes that her sister said in a previous letter that white Spencers are now worn, and so she wants to know whether they're made lined or not, what style the sleeves are in, how full the neck ruffle should be. And she observes that she's actually not very clever about contriving such things, and so she wants a pattern sent if at all possible. She also asks that her sister send her a dress bodice pattern made to her own measurements. So even though she says that she looks a bit rusty compared to what she'd look like at home and that she hasn't sewn for a year, which is a lie. She was sewing for her children, but not for herself. She also came across by the steamer to Panama the previous autumn directly from New York and had been buying her wedding trousseau in New York City. So even here, where she's saying that she looks rusty and not good enough for at home, she's also still wearing clothing that was, contemporary to New York less than 9 months before. Um, she also was a bloomer adherent, which if we have time, I'd love to get to later. So to get into some actual dresses instead of just looking at photographs and lists of fabric, this is the dress with the clearest Puget Sound provenance to the 1850s that I've found. It's in the Mohai collection in Seattle and is reputed to be the wedding dress of Elizabeth Kirkland, 1858. It is a sheer dress. It's described as a mull, which would be a cotton, though I was not able to test the fibers in it to determine for certain. Silk and wool sheer dresses were also known. But in addition to having some pretty standard 1850s, like the wide flowing skirt and the beautiful open sleeves, I really love what they've done using tucks to make interest and contrast in the sheer material. She's got purely decorative three sets of tucks on the skirt, which are repeated in horizontal folds through the bodice. It's a very common 1850s style to use excessive fullness from shoulder to waist and have it pleated up to make a pleasing effect. This dress has been badly damaged, as you can see. It also has been pretty badly altered. The open sleeves and the undersleeves in those open sleeves are a machine-made net that is very not 1850s. There's this contrasting little bit of brown satin at the waist from where the waistband has been let out to make the 22-inch waist dress up to a 27-inch waist dress, and the skirt's been pretty badly repleated to fit over that extended area. Her daughter-in-law apparently used to wear this dress to give presentations about the old days, and so I'm tempted to assume from the, shall we say, low quality of the alterations that that's when it was altered. Another dress. So the Blaines I keep talking about, this is a picture of them. But the Washington State Historical Society actually has a dress attributed to Catherine Blaine here. And this is it. It is a beautiful brown taffeta. It is, so I say, probably completely hand sewn. There's a single bit of stitching on the bodice that is very small, very tight back stitching that I could not actually tell from visual inspection whether it was a machine stitch or a machine lock stitch or a very tight hand back stitch. The entire rest of the dress, however, is hand sewn, so I'm tempted to speculate that it's just an 18 stitch per inch back stitch, but distinct possibility. The rest of it is very clearly hand sewn. Generally, she's sewing about 12 stitches to the inch. She has a white glazed cotton lining on the inside of the sleeves. It has a facing of a black glazed cotton around the hem. At some point, someone turned the hem up to shorten the dress, but they did not reset the hem facing or take off the hem tape that was being used around the bottom to guard it. The bodice has this beautiful, really simple but effective velvet ribbon. It's laid on in 3 stripes right over the shaping darts of the bodice. There's 3 per side, which is, again, a fairly common 1850s look that's less popular than 2 darts as you get into the 1860s. And it's really tempting to speculate that this is the dress that she describes in her letters as my silk, her singular silk, her only silk dress. She says shortly after arriving in Seattle that she has no occasion to wear it in the woods, and so has put it away. I mean, the big flowing sleeves here do make it very classic late 1850s, so it's possible that this is that dress. It's also possible that she got another silk dress later, and this is a later one. But let's give me a good idea of what she's wearing out this way in Seattle and Portland. A little closer to home, but also a little bit later, still territorial Washington, but 1868, 69, we have in Steilacoom, if anyone's been to the gorgeous historical society there, and the historic home that it is in. So this is the dress that was the going away dress, which is to say a part of a wedding trousseau for, God, why do you just have those days when you suddenly cannot think of someone's proper name? Not the Clarks, Orr. It's the Orr family. With my apologies to them. So it's Emma Orr's dress from 1868. So in the one picture, you have her and her husband around the time of their wedding, and the other, you have a niece of hers wearing the dress with an overskirt that was later added to it in. It's being worn in the 1950s. The alterations date from around 1870. The dress itself is still in the Steilacoom Historical Society. Unfortunately, I'm very bad at trying to get a good picture of it, so the ones I took of the full dress did not come through. But here are some detailed pictures of that dress. And by comparing the trim on the sleeves, it concluded that it is in fact the same dress as in the picture. But you can see she's got that polished cotton facing applied to the bottom. This is the original hem tape, and so like the Blaine dress, this dress has had its hem folded up, and so this protective tape is no longer protecting the end of the dress. There is up to 4 different sets of alterations that this dress went through. So when you're looking here so this is the lower left picture of the dress here is looking at the back of the dress. It has a little faux 3-piece effect going on with these curved seams. But looking at the side, which is easy to see in person and hard to see in this picture, the back seams here and here have been let out by approximately 2 inches per side. So they were made, as many dresses this period were, with a very wide over 1 inch seam allowance in the back. And then that seam was later opened up and re-sewed closer together so that they were able to add almost 4 inches to the waist of the dress. It was 2 and 1/16 inch on one side and 1 and 15/16 inches on the other. And as a result, the back pleat here of the skirt is a little bit off center because they essentially just let out some of the pleating on the front skirt to allow for the expanded waist here. This was all done in one go. There's no additional stitching lines. So it's tempting to speculate that she did that alteration in 1870 after the birth of her first child. We don't know for certain. The other piece of alteration is this puffy overskirt, sort of an entabler or apron shape, which is very popular right around 1870, 1871. It actually shows up in the London Women's Journal as what you can do with your straight gorge skirts from last year to make them fashionable is add this entabler style overskirt. It has a waistband that's actually 2 inches bigger than the dress itself. And this is what you're seeing, all that fluffiness in the picture of Mrs. Orr's niece. Why doesn't it want to let me go back? So going back too far. So you've got the dress in its original configuration with the gourd skirt that's still pretty full all the way around, coat sleeves, drop shoulder, little tiny 1 inch band collar. And here it's being worn over probably a crinoline of the sort of elliptical shape, moving more towards the bustle. And then later when bustles are fully in is when that entabler overskirt with the gathered back shows up. The niece here is not wearing the appropriate bustle underneath, so you're not getting quite the full shape, but That's what's going on there. Only have a few minutes left, so I'll try and speed this up. This was another dress that I found very interesting. This is actually from Oregon, Washington County, Oregon, just outside of Portland. Um, but this is an 1865 wedding dress that had been remade from an 1834 wedding dress. And with all the references from people like the Meekers and the Denny's to remaking clothing, to patching clothing, particularly when they're talking about coming over the trail, Meeker's description of the immigrants arriving at the Dalles, that there was clothing that was so discolored with in-ground dirt that you couldn't tell the original color, with patches upon patches, with people in all states of dress, ranging from people who actually look very formal, just like they would in sort of in a normal social life, but lacking some necessary features such as a bonnet or a hat, all the way down to children whose clothing makes no pretensions to gentility except to cover up their nakedness. And so this dress I found very interesting if you're looking particularly at this bit here on the underside of the ruffle, where you can see that the bias cut ruffle here has been joined from tiny pieces all the way down to about 2 inches, some of which have signs of old stitch marks, particularly the tight rows of old gauging or old shearing. And as far as I can tell, because some of those show up on the skirt panels themselves near the bottom, and some of them show up on the ruffles, it appears that they took the rectangular cut skirt of the original dress, cut it into a gourd shape, more popular in the late 1860s, and then took the little triangles cut off from the tops of each former rectangle to make them a gore, and pieced those cut along the bias to make these little ruffles. This little black band here is also very distinctly 1865, 1866 in terms of fashion. There's a very interesting article that shows up in Godey's in 1866 that refers to the fashion for having a contrasting black band. But the author is writing about the difficulties of making and maintaining clothing in Georgia during the Civil War with the lack of cloth imports. And that was such a common trick to make an old skirt last longer and refresh it, to put on a black band along the bottom, that all the high fashion dresses that now are using that, this author just cannot stand seeing because it reminds her of the bad old days. And what I found really intriguing with this is that I'm pretty sure that band is completely fashionable, because there's actually been a tuck taken on the underside of the skirt on the inside underneath this top ruffle to shorten it. And the way the ruffle's attached directly over the tuck can't have been done later. So it's not that someone made this dress and needed to lengthen it with an extra piece and then later needed to shorten it. It's at the same time they were lengthening it with this contrasting black band, they also were shortening the overall length to make it fit, which I found very intriguing. So sort of a last remark here, I want to include, this is a quilt made by Catherine McLeod Mounts, who was born in Washington Territory, Nisqually, in the 1850s. And what I really love about this is an example of the fabric that was available in the territory that is not still in a garment. Since a lot of references to people making and remaking include turning old garments into quilts, include turning old garments into rag rugs, and even into curtains. And so this quilt might have been made out of old garment scraps, or it might have been made out of pieces of cloth bought for that purpose. But the 3 sort of main types of prints she's using are white prints on blue, which is what James Swan in the late 1850s described as the single most popular style of printed cloth among Native women. That's the most highly desired one and the one they're most interested in trading for. The individual squares are worked with that, and then with a blue print on white. And then they're sashed with a white and pink print, so pink on white background. And those blue and pink on white backgrounds are the 2 prints that Emily Denny describes as, by the 1870s at least, being the most popular things for the women of Seattle to wear, that the Sunday best dresses were made of these prints. And I find it very intriguing that those 3 things, the only times that people are actually describing prints in color detail, are precisely what Catherine used on her quilt. It's tempting to speculate that those then are the most popular colors, since they're the only ones that get referenced, and then they're what we can see here. So we're reaching the end of our time, so I want to thank Historic Fort Steilacoom and Jessica for making this possible. Many of the museum collections and repositories that this research relied on, including the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, Steilacoom Historical Museum, definitely go check them out. And if you can't get there in person, their online photo collection is beautiful. It's the most extensive one I've seen for this period in Washington history. UW Special Collections, which hosts the Denny Papers, Washington State Historical Society, which has the Blaine dress, Fort Nisqually Living History Museum with their extensive commercial records, as well as Letitia Works Sewing Machine and Catherine McLeod Mount's quilt, Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, and the Kashmir Museum. And
All right, thank you
anyone?
so much, Elizabeth. We have just a couple minutes if anybody has a question, a dire question for Elizabeth. If you would like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask if you do.
Jessica, this is Joe.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, I have a question for you. Given the nature of ladies' fashions, how did they cope with all of the mud and the horse manure in the streets with those long skirts? What did they do? Pull them up?
That's what the guidebooks suggest. Miss Leslie's behavior book in particularly says that there's a proper way to do that. You should use one hand to draw the skirt up just as far as you need to get it out of the way. You should not be lifting your skirt in both hands. That's very vulgar. Other tricks that you see elsewhere include looping the skirts up. There's actually a dress in the Mohai collection, which I didn't include here because it's from England, but it has a series of cords sewn to small loops inside the dress. And there's a pair of buttons attached to the front waistband, and you can pull the buttons and sort of raise the dress like it's a pair of curtains. And so it's then swagged over an underskirt, which actually became a very popular style in the 1860s, since that's how Queen Victoria would arrange her skirts when she went hiking in the Scottish Highlands at Balmoral. And so you end up with a fashion for walking dresses with a Balmoral petticoat, often of red or else of plaid material, that's meant to be seen with the skirt of your dress proper sort of swagged up above it fashionably. One thing I know that was done out here, specifically crossing the trail, that Meeker describes his wife and the women in their wagon train adding tucks to their dress. So they're essentially sewing a little vertical seam around the skirt, just like on the Kirkland wedding dress, that then doubles up the fabric and shortens the overall length of the dress. Those particular functional tucks were taken down after they arrived in the territory. It's one of the signs Meeker says that life is returning to normal. But for the extensive amount of walking in the dirty trail conditions, that's what that particular group did, and that we can document to the area.
Thank you.
Oh, that was a good question. Dallas? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
That's correct. Was there any other reporting of deviations from the usual styles of clothing, like attempting to wear trousers or
There's one. So Meeker's remarks have been interpreted by many other people as a sign that people were wearing the bloomer or reform costume. However, if you compare his 1916 account, which speaks of the whole party of women wearing bloomer costumes, to his 1905 account, he, in the 1905 account, is using bloomer specifically to discuss the length of the dress. So his wife looks almost like a bloomer. He describes it the little bloomer lady, but the tucks he specifies were something that was done on the trail when they were in progress, and he also talks about them not having much fabric to work with. So I find it highly unlikely that they actually were making the trousers to go with the dresses, and I think his uses were specifically saying shorter dress equals bloomer costume, which is consistent with how people use the term bloomer in the 1860s and 50s. They almost always use it to mean a woman wearing dress reform or an entire dress reform outfit or even just a short dress. And they almost never use the term bloomer. In fact, I've never seen it used specifically to talk about the trousers and the trousers alone. That being said, Catherine Blaine of the beautiful brown silk dress and the baby was actually wearing bloomer's costume dress reform in Seneca Falls, New York before she came out west. She wrote a letter to her husband, her fiance at that point, as they were making their preparations, and he was in a different town, asking his opinion on whether she should quit her current convenient mode of dress. And she sort of lays out the pros and cons. She thinks that in Washington Territory it'll be convenient and that people will not be as prejudiced against it as they are in New York. But she's also concerned that it might not reflect well on their Methodist mission. But she's also then concerned, on the third hand, that it will take longer for her to remake her wardrobe. And then later on, when she's out here, she specifically mentions on one occasion that her green delaine dress had longer skirts, and so she had a longer petticoat with it. And on a separate occasion, when she's getting out of a canoe in her black delaine, that the dress has mud up to the skirt and her pantaloons were completely filthy. And she could have been using pantaloons to mean her drawers, the bifurcated undergarment that most women are wearing at this time, but she could also be using that to mean the trouser portion of a bloomer costume. And it's very tempting with her specifying that the green delaine is long and then mentioning pantalettes in conjunction with the black, that perhaps her black delaine is a shorter bloomer dress with the matching trousers and that her green is a longer one without. The surviving dress that we have of hers has a 39-inch skirt at the center front, which, unless she has incredibly long legs, is going to be a full-length dress as opposed to a bloomer length. But the two pictures I found of her of this period are both only pictures of the upper body, so you cannot actually see the length of her skirt.
Awesome. That's another good question. And of course, Elizabeth always has a wonderful answer.
Well, those are things I actually meant to address and didn't, so thank you for bringing them up.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Elizabeth. We really appreciate you giving us your time and your knowledge and sharing that with us. And again, thank you everyone for participating and supporting Elizabeth and the Historic Fort Steilacoom Association. We wish you have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll see you again at whatever else may be coming in the future. Thank you.